All right, welcome back to the deep dive. You know we love diving into the listener mailbag, and you guys send in so much great stuff on this topic. So today we're looking at pathological narcissism.
Yeah, lots of interest in this one, and some really good material to work with today.
We are, and we're going to be taking a look at a treatment approach that I think offers a really fresh perspective.
It does, it does. And our main source today is the book Mentalization-Based Treatment for Pathological Narcissism.
Drozek, Unruh, and Bateman.
That's right.
And this book basically lays out a framework, right, for helping individuals with pathological narcissism regain the ability to mentalize, to understand minds their own and others.
Exactly.
So for our listeners out there, our goal in this deep dive is to pull out those crucial insights about pathological narcissism. How does it develop? What does it look like in action? And how can mentalization-based treatment, MBT for short, how can this approach actually make a difference? We're really hoping to deliver some of those moments that just help make a complex topic suddenly click. So, okay, let's unpack this. First off, what exactly is mentalizing?
So mentalizing is basically the ability to understand mental states.
Yeah.
Both in yourself and others.
Okay.
So being able to grasp and understand your own thoughts, your own feelings, your desires, your beliefs.
Right.
But also to kind of put yourself in other people's shoes and imagine what might be going on in their minds.
So am I hearing this right? It's not just an intellectual, oh, I know they might be feeling sad, but it's this deeper recognition of their inner world and how that sadness, for instance, might be shaping their actions.
Yeah, exactly. It's that ability to step back and see ourselves and others as having these rich internal worlds, these minds, and to recognize that it's these internal landscapes that drive our behavior.
Okay, so that's mentalizing. Now, this MBT approach wasn't originally developed for pathological narcissism, right?
No, that's right. It was initially developed for borderline personality disorder.
Oh.
Or BPD.
BPD, right.
And I think what's really important for your listeners to know is that there's a lot of evidence that supports its success with BPD. There have been a number of, really well-conducted studies that show substantial and really important lasting improvements in people's lives who go through this type of therapy.
How substantial, like how long are we talking about here, the impact?
Well, there have been follow-up studies that have tracked people for 5 years, so some studies even as long as 8 years.
Wow.
And they confirm these initial positive outcomes. People experience fewer crises. They need fewer mental health services.
Okay.
They're more likely to be engaged in work or education. The pioneering work of Anthony Bateman really set a lot of the foundation for this kind of therapy.
Wow. 8 years is a long time to see an impact from something like this, so that really does highlight the potential power of focusing on these mentalization skills.
It does.
So with this solid track record in treating BPD, with the focus on strengthening mentalizing skills, how does this book explain the development of pathological narcissism through that lens?
So that's where it gets really interesting. One of the things that the authors introduce is this idea of the I mode, which is basically your fundamental sense of self.
Okay.
That core feeling of meanness.
Okay.
And then there's the me mode, which is how you represent yourself as an object, your self-image, the kind of picture you hold of who you are.
Okay, I'm following.
And in pathological narcissism, the me mode tends to be very rigid and inflexible.
What do you mean inflexible? Inflexible in what way?
Because it's very tightly bound to maintaining the coherence of that I mode. So any shift or change in how they see themselves in that me mode can trigger this kind of flood of existential anxiety or what they've been trying to kind of keep away from that core sense of self.
So it's almost like they've got this very fragile structure, and any wobble in that me mode feels like it could just bring the whole thing down.
Exactly.
So they really struggle to adapt how they see themselves, even when reality might suggest otherwise.
Right.
And the book also mentions this idea of a narcissistic alien self, which I thought was just such a fascinating term. What does that refer to?
So the narcissistic alien self is thought to develop from these early mirroring experiences that are very intense, kind of exaggerated, but non-contingent, meaning that they don't really reflect the child's genuine feelings and experiences. So parental overvaluation is a common example of this.
Right.
So the child might constantly be told that they're exceptionally talented or special, even when their actual achievements or their emotional state, don't really align with that praise.
Right.
This kind of mirroring emphasizes certain qualities, like strength or confidence.
Okay.
But it consistently undervalues or even ignores more vulnerable emotions.
So they're being told they're this amazing person, but their actual, maybe more tender, uncertain feelings aren't reflected back.
Exactly. Exactly. And so what happens is this kind of alien self is created, kind of a
Right.
representation of how the overvaluing caregiver sees them,
Right.
which doesn't quite map onto their own inner emotional world.
Okay.
And the result is this feeling of emptiness,
Mm-hmm.
this lack of a really cohesive, authentic self.
Right.
And this internal conflict, stemming from this disconnect between the perceived self and the felt self, this is what drives so many of the behaviors that we associate with narcissism.
It's almost like they're constantly trying to live up to this image that doesn't feel truly theirs,
Right.
this image that was imposed on them.
Right, right. Exactly.
Now, the book also contrasts this with BPD
Yeah.
in terms of how these internal states are kind of projected. How's that different?
Yeah, this is a really important point. So in BPD, there's often this tendency to project the feelings of badness outwards onto others. It's kind of like an I'm not bad, you're bad sort of dynamic.
Okay.
But in pathological narcissism, it's almost the reverse. The sense of goodness or perfection is projected onto the self. I'm amazing, or at least this need to feel superior.
Got it.
And this is that self-enhancement mechanism that they talk about.
Okay.
It's a way to try and maintain that fragile sense of self.
So while BPD might involve externalizing blame, pathological narcissism involves this kind of intense self-idealization as a defense.
Exactly. Exactly. And what the authors emphasize is that these limitations in mentalizing, this difficulty, genuinely understanding their own and others' inner experiences, this really impairs their ability to create coherent life narratives.
Right.
To make sense of their own history, their own relationships.
Okay.
And this ultimately undermines their well-being.
I see. So we've got this good understanding of kind of the foundational issues there. Now, shifting to what we often observe, on the surface, what are some of the key characteristics that really define pathological narcissism?
So the book outlines the kind of widely recognized symptoms that I'm sure you've come across in discussions of narcissism.
Okay.
A grandiose sense of self-importance.
Okay.
A preoccupation with fantasies of unlimited success, power, brilliance, beauty, ideal love.
Right.
A belief that they are special and unique.
Okay.
And can only be understood by or should associate with other special or high-status people.
Right.
Institutions even.
Right.
A need for excessive admiration.
Okay.
A sense of entitlement.
Mm-hmm.
A tendency to be interpersonally exploitative. A lack of empathy.
Okay.
Often being envious of others,
Mm-hmm.
or believing that others are envious of them,
Right.
and demonstrating arrogant, haughty behaviors or attitudes.
That's quite a list. And I know there's often talk about different kind of presentations of narcissism. Does the book go into that at all?
It does, yeah, and this is an important distinction.
Okay.
It talks about the difference between what's called grandiose or overt narcissism
Okay.
and vulnerable narcissism, which is also referred to as covert narcissism or insecure narcissism.
Okay.
So grandiose narcissism is what often comes to mind
Okay.
when we think of those outward displays of arrogance and superiority. But vulnerable narcissism actually involves a more defensively grandiose presentation
Okay.
that often masks these underlying feelings of inadequacy and shame and negative emotion.
So it's not always the person who's like loudly boasting about themselves. It can also be someone who's more withdrawn, highly sensitive to criticism, but still with that underlying sense of entitlement.
Exactly. Exactly. And clinicians really encounter a whole spectrum of these presentations,
Right.
often with complex combinations of outward arrogance, underlying insecurity, and various kind of attention-seeking behaviors.
So we've gotten a deeper understanding of what pathological narcissism is, how it might develop, when viewed through this mentalizing lens. But how does the mentalization-based model of PN specifically explain this condition?
So the model proposes three core interconnected factors that contribute to PN.
Okay.
The first is attachment-related inhibition of mentalization. And this really highlights the strong link between pathological narcissism and insecure attachment styles,
Okay.
particularly avoidant and detached patterns.
Okay.
So these individuals often protect themselves from anticipated disappointment or rejection in close relationships by either avoiding intimacy altogether or by becoming excessively self-reliant and kind of seemingly insensitive to others' needs. Interestingly, grandiose narcissism has also been linked to dismissive attachment styles,
Okay.
whereas vulnerable narcissism is more associated with anxious attachment.
So their early relational experiences really set the stage in a way for their ability to mentalize
Yeah,
and to really connect with
that's
others.
exactly.
What's the second key factor in this model?
So the second factor is the reemergence of what are called non-mentalizing modes of experience.
Okay.
And these are kind of more primitive, early ways of thinking about mental states.
Yeah.
And the book really focuses on three of these:
Okay.
psychic equivalence,
Okay.
pretend mode,
Pretend mode.
and teleological mode.
Okay. Break those down for us a little bit. What exactly is psychic equivalence?
So psychic equivalence is this feeling that your thoughts and feelings directly reflect reality
Okay.
without any filter, without any separation between your internal world and the external world. So if someone with pathological narcissism thinks they are superior, they experience that thought as absolute truth,
Okay.
completely impervious to any contradictory evidence.
Interesting.
Like if you think about it, if you have the thought, I'm right, and you feel it very strongly, you're not really open to any other evidence.
Yeah.
That's kind of a glimpse into psychic equivalence.
Oh, okay. That's a great explanation. Now, this pretend mode, this is an interesting one.
Yeah. And it can sound kind of, well, odd when we're talking about it in this context.
Right.
Because in this context, pretend mode isn't really about playful imagination.
Okay.
It's more characterized by an over-reliance on intellectualization,
Okay.
abstract thinking,
Yeah.
and cognitive explanation,
Okay.
often coupled with a very noticeable disconnection from genuine emotions and desires.
Got it.
So someone might be able to discuss very complex psychological theories about relationships, for example,
Okay.
but they really struggle to identify or articulate their own feelings within their actual relationships.
Right.
It's kind of like a pretend I mode,
Right.
where the intellectual understanding isn't translated into a felt sense, a felt emotional reality.
So they can talk about feelings and experiences, but there's a lack of genuine engagement with those feelings.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so then we have this third mode, teleological. How does that show up in pathological narcissism?
So teleological mode is basically understanding mental states primarily through observable external outcomes.
Yeah.
So it's like, if I achieve this certain status, then I must be worthy.
Okay.
Or if someone does this for me, then it proves that they care.
Right.
So there's a real focus on these concrete results as the primary indicator of inner states,
Okay.
rather than really considering the underlying thoughts, feelings, and intentions.
So instead of trying to understand the reasons behind someone's actions or, their internal world, they're just focused on the results.
Right, exactly.
Okay, so that's psychic equivalence, pretend mode, and teleological mode. And then the third core factor, right, in the MBT model of PN is this constant pressure to actualize that narcissistic alien self that we talked about before.
Right.
This idealized but inauthentic representation of themselves that develops from those early non-contingent mirroring experiences.
Exactly.
It's like this constant striving to become this person they're not, driven by this, often distorted feedback that they received early on.
Right.
So this model's really starting to connect the dots between those developmental experiences and, the resulting cognitive and emotional difficulties.
It is. It is.
Now, when it comes to the actual therapeutic process, how does MBT for pathological narcissism approach assessment and diagnosis?
So assessment in MBT really emphasizes developing a deep understanding of the person's individual perspective
Okay.
on their presenting problems,
Okay.
their unique social and psychological world, and really exploring their narcissistic processes.
Okay.
This includes identifying their often very implicit expectations, their typical self-enhancement strategies, and how their sense of self-esteem kind of fluctuates and is maintained.
Okay.
It's not just about, checking off a list of diagnostic criteria.
Right.
It's much more nuanced and in-depth than that.
So how do therapists actually uncover these narcissistic expectations?
So therapists pay very close attention to the language the patient uses,
Okay.
particularly any evaluative statements.
Mm-hmm.
The ways they assign positive or negative value to themselves or others.
Okay.
And once these kind of patterns of evaluation are noticed, the therapist might gently invite the patient to elaborate,
Okay.
explore the feelings associated with those evaluations,
Okay.
and gradually help them connect those specific narcissistic expectations to their underlying sense of self-esteem.
Okay. That makes sense. And what about these self-enhancement processes? How are those explored in therapy?
Therapists often encourage patients to talk openly about the specific strategies they use to kind of bolster their self-image
Right.
and restore this sense of inner coherence when they feel threatened or inadequate. And they explore together, what are the feelings that drive these strategies?
Right.
And crucially, how might these self-enhancement efforts actually be contributing to difficulties in their functioning in relationships?
Right. It's like helping them see these patterns that are, driving their behavior.
Right. Exactly.
Now, what are the core principles that really guide mentalization-based treatment for pathological narcissism, MBTN?
A really fundamental principle is adopting a supportive and deliberately non-authoritarian stance.
Okay.
So this involves actively taking what's called a not knowing position.
Not knowing.
Yeah. Offering consistent empathic validation of the patient's experience,
Okay.
actively reinforcing any instances of mentalizing that the patient shows,
Okay.
and even being willing to take responsibility for any missteps or misunderstandings that might occur in the therapeutic relationship.
Not knowing. This is a really interesting concept.
It is. It really reflects this essential humility.
Yeah.
Recognizing that we can never fully know another person's mind
Right.
or their internal experience. It means approaching each interaction with genuine curiosity and tentativeness,
Okay.
avoiding making definitive interpretations, but fostering more of a collaborative process,
Right.
mutual exploration and reflection. This stance is especially important when working with people who are, highly sensitive to feeling misunderstood,
Right.
judged, or controlled.
That makes sense. If you come at them with a more directive or confrontational approach, it could easily shut down the whole process.
Right, exactly.
What other core principles guide MBTN?
Another one is actively structuring the sessions. So as we talked about, patients with pathological narcissism sometimes default to this pretend mode,
Okay.
engaging in abstract narratives, intellectualizations
Okay.
that avoid real emotional engagement.
Okay.
So the therapist actively guides the session to keep the focus on authentic exploration of feelings and experiences.
Okay.
Additionally, carefully managing the person's level of emotional arousal is really crucial, because high emotional intensity can actually temporarily impair their capacity to mentalize.
Right.
And finally, MBTN really emphasizes this gradual progression of experiential context within the therapy,
Okay.
starting with discussing then and there events, things that happen outside of the session,
Right.
and gradually moving towards exploring the here and now dynamics of the therapeutic relationship itself.
So you start with things that are less emotionally charged
Right.
and then slowly move towards what's happening in the room.
Exactly.
Okay. What are some of the specific interventions that MBTN therapists actually use?
So the book kind of helpfully categorizes interventions into three types.
Yeah.
Content-focused interventions,
Okay. Yeah.
context-focused interventions,
Okay.
and process-focused interventions.
Got it.
So content-focused interventions are kind of the foundational skills.
Okay.
And they include clarification, simply asking for more information about what happened.
Okay.
Affect elaboration, encouraging the patient to explore their feeling states and impressions.
Right.
And empathic validation,
Okay.
reflecting back to the person and understanding what they're communicating,
Right.
both in terms of the content and the emotion.
So these are kind of like core therapeutic techniques in general.
They are.
How do these context-focused interventions then build on that foundation?
So context-focused interventions are aimed at helping the person mentalize their specific behaviors.
Okay.
So this involves exploring what were the triggers, the precipitants of a behavior. What mental states were you experiencing before, during, and after the behavior? What were the consequences of your actions?
Okay.
And it also involves looking at broader patterns of behavior over time
Okay.
and exploring potential future possibilities.
Mhm.
Importantly, direct advice giving is generally avoided
Okay.
to maintain the focus on the person's own developing capacity to mentalize.
So instead of telling them what they should do, you're helping them to understand kind of the mental processes behind their actions.
Right, exactly.
Okay. And then what about these process-focused interventions? What are they targeting?
So process-focused interventions are designed to directly address the non-mentalizing modes
Okay.
that we talked about earlier.
Okay.
So for psychic equivalence, that very rigid, certain style of thinking,
Right.
the therapeutic techniques involve gently challenging the person's assumptions,
Okay.
exploring alternative perspectives.
Got it.
For teleological mode, that reliance on external outcomes.
Right.
The interventions help the person to focus more on their own internal experiences and others' internal experiences,
Okay.
regardless of the results.
Right.
So humor, paradox, emotion-focused inquiries, providing reality-based feedback can all be used to kind of challenge these less flexible ways of thinking.
So it's about disrupting those patterns.
It is. It is.
The book also emphasizes mentalizing the therapeutic relationship itself. Why is that so important?
Because the therapeutic relationship inevitably becomes a reflection of the patient's typical interpersonal patterns and the challenges they face. So mentalizing the relationship involves both the therapist and the patient paying attention to the two minds in the room and actively working to avoid blaming the patient for any difficulties or ruptures in the alliance. Specific techniques include, what are called relational tracers, where the therapist kind of points out parallels between what's happening in the therapy and the patient's relationships outside of therapy.
Got it.
Interpersonal affect focus, where these implicit emotional processes are kind of named and explored. And even sometimes judicious, effective self-disclosure, where the therapist might share their own emotional responses in the moment. But the emphasis is always on collaborative exploration.
I got it.
And the therapist taking responsibility for their own contributions to the interaction.
So it's about using that therapy itself as a way to understand these relational difficulties.
Right.
Now, considering the potential for really, significant emotional distress in pathological narcissism, how does MBTN address suicidal behavior specifically?
So the book explains that for people with pathological narcissism, the risk of suicide is often lowest when their self-image is feeling positive, unchallenged. But experiences of what are called narcissistic injuries. So any event that significantly reduces their self-esteem, like perceived competitive losses, feeling publicly criticized, or experiencing this profound sense of being misunderstood, this can trigger very intense non-mentalizing states and overwhelming negative emotions.
So it's like a threat to that self-idealization.
Exactly. And so therapists really explore the underlying kind of teleological self-esteem narratives that contribute to the idea of suicide as a potential escape hatch from these unbearable feelings. Feelings of failure, shame, humiliation. They also try to understand the function of any self-destructive behaviors. Is it an attempt to reassert control, or is it some way of trying to actualize that idealized positive self-image?
So it's not just an impulsive act, it's driven by these deeper needs.
Exactly.
Finally, what does therapeutic progress typically look like in MBTN for pathological narcissism, and what are some of the challenges that therapists might run into?
So effective treatment for pathological narcissism often requires a longer time frame than MBT for BPD. Typically ranging from 2 to 4 years. The book points out that periods of disengagement or kind of treatment pauses can happen. And it's really crucial to maintain a connection with the patient during those times. They talk about some really fascinating case examples. Individuals like Brenda, Chloe, Jane, and William, who illustrate these different aspects of treatment. Like addressing initial defensiveness, grandiosity, exploring kind of the intersection of faith and identity with these narcissistic traits. Managing the patient's, what they call need for matching in relationships. And working through issues of, secrecy and dishonesty.
So it's a long and kind of intricate process.
It is.
But one that offers real hope for growth and change.
It does.
It takes a lot of patience.
It does.
A lot of empathy.
That's
like a really thorough understanding of those underlying mentalizing deficits. Well, I think this deep dive has been so illuminating because it really shows that pathological narcissism is so much more than just vanity or self-centeredness.
It is. It's deeply rooted in these early relational experiences and this fundamental difficulty in understanding the inner world, both their own and that of others. And mentalization-based treatment provides a really thoughtful, structured approach to help them develop this more adaptable and coherent sense of self, and to foster healthier, more fulfilling relationships by strengthening that capacity to mentalize.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that I found really insightful is how the core principles of not knowing and this emphasis on understanding different perspectives, which are central to MBT, they really underscore the importance of humility and genuine curiosity.
Absolutely.
In all of our interactions.
Yeah, it makes you think about how we might apply some of these principles, even outside of a therapeutic setting.
Exactly. So for our listeners, if you found this exploration of pathological narcissism and MBT interesting, we highly recommend checking out the work of Anthony Bateman and Peter Fonagy, who have been pioneers in this area. The Anna Freud Center also provides a lot of valuable resources and training on MBT. You can find them online.
And, maybe take some time to reflect on the ways in which you and the people around you engage in this process of mentalizing. Because it's often these kind of invisible processes that really shape how we understand ourselves and the world.
Well, thanks for joining us for this deep dive,
It's been a pleasure.
and we'll see you next time.